So Christopher Tolkien passed away 2 days ago. The reason I've eschewed my normal opening music from the fine band Wreck the System is that music's a little upbeat to talk about a recent death. And already I've had a couple of people ask me about Christopher Tolkien. And so I want to talk a very little bit about his legacy. It's very likely that we'll cover this in greater depth on the Pop Medieval podcast. So if you don't get enough here, this just happened, so I'm assuming we'll do some more there. So why does this matter? I think is the biggest question. There are lots of famous authors, and when their children die, no one cares, right? List your favorite author. You probably don't even know if they have children. So why in this case do we care? Why is it news? Why does it matter? Well, there's two reasons. And one reason is really a reason of popular culture. And I'll start with that, then I'll talk about the academic stuff a little bit. So in terms of popular culture, already in the 1960s and certainly by the 1970s, you really saw, different parts of the culture sort of grabbing hold of Tolkien's fantasy works, less so his scholarly work, the kind of stuff that people like me study. But his fantasy work, people were really pretty interested in it. And so after he died, it's very common to have a literary executor of your estate. I also have a small publishing company, and we've had authors die. In fact, an author die. And that author, before he died, made us aware that he'd have a literary executor. And so we worked with her to make sure that we protected all of his work from people who might take advantage of his death, to make sure people didn't try to republish his work under other names and things, and talked with her about strategies she might do to protect her work. So if you don't know any authors, you don't know, this is pretty common to have a literary executor of your estate, or executor of your literary estate, I suppose. And so Christopher Tolkien fulfilled that role for many years. And for a long time, he really worked hard to keep, actually for his whole life, he worked hard to prevent a lot of the mass market, non-literary popularization of his father's work. So he resisted the making of any of the Lord of the Rings or Hobbit movies. They were able to be made through legal machinations that he was really resisted and was really against. As I recall, he died in his 90s, having never seen any of the films. Someone can correct me if that had since changed, but as far as I know, he had never seen them. And so, for a long time, he was the guy who was kind of protecting the works. Well, I can remember that among kind of Tolkien nerds like me, before Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies, we really thought that he was this sort of very important person who was keeping everything from being kind of cheesy and stupid. If you just look at Leonard Nimoy's wonderfully terrible, campy Song of Bilbo Baggins, look it up on YouTube, you see what could have been the kind of governing, I guess, ethos around what happened with Lord of the Rings, or with the Tolkien, the whole literary oeuvre. Well, after Jackson's Lord of the Rings series came out, not only was it a huge, unbelievable hit, but it also, I think, changed popular culture's opinion of Christopher Tolkien, because, of course, it was much harder for them to make some version of The Hobbit without his consent. As you know, they eventually did do that. And so there seemed to be a lot of people who felt like he was the one keeping us from having something great. That Jackson had really had really respected the work and had done something really interesting and had made more people interested in Tolkien's books. And he kind of became this popular culture villain. And then Jackson's Hobbit movies came out, and they were kind of universally acknowledged at best as being inferior to his adaptation of Lord of the Rings, and more commonly as just being bad and terrible. Not as bad as Leonard Nimoy's Song of Bilbo Baggins, but that this had not been a mistake, or that it had been a mistake, and that we should have listened to Christopher Tolkien all along. And so Christopher Tolkien has, in kind of nerd culture, has both been the hero and the villain, depending on, what your perspective was, and also when it was. My own view of him is that the decades that have happened thus far have kind of demonstrated the wisdom of his approach. And I've always been a little partisan toward him, to be fair. So that's kind of the weird role he played, but we normally don't know who are the executors of the estates of the authors that we like. So why else would he matter? Well, the other reason that he matters is because of his scholarship. He really started in the 1960s doing real medieval scholarship, and he didn't do very much, but the scholarship that he did was always good and well received. And so when he edited his father's books, the work seemed to have been slow, and you could see the amount of output he had was slow, but it continued all the way up. It takes some time to publish a book. I'm assuming that Baron and Luthien, I think it was 2016, so he probably was 90 years old by the time, when he was working on that. If not, he was quickly approaching 90, and he was still steadily working. And the work that he did was careful. Occasionally you'll find someone saying, I would have made a different choice at this point. But rarely, in fact, I can't ever think of a time that I heard a scholar say, he doesn't know what he's doing, he's ruining everything. All the choices he made were defensible, and I think people generally seem to think that they were the right choices. If there's any beef against him, in terms of his scholarship, it's that often people complain he didn't give enough footnotes or scholarly apparatus. Now, that actually begins back in the 1960s in his early translations of other medieval things, is the kind of the, you saw reviews of people saying, well, he should have had more footnotes. I'm someone who, over the course of my career, has really worked purposefully to restrict my footnotes for complicated reasons that don't belong here. But I've really worked to do that. So I'm very sympathetic to his approach to scholarship. And I think when people look at his work, no one looks at it and says, well, this is amateurish. So I don't really think, even though people will complain about that, I don't really think that even the people who complain about that, that there's not enough bibliography, there's not enough footnotes, there's not enough of the kind of scholarly stuff that people want to grab hold of. I don't think people really see that as a serious complaint. They're just a minor quibble. So with the death of Christopher Tolkien, people could say, well, we've lost this kind of guardian of Tolkien's work in popular culture. But the truth is, New Line was eventually able to make the Hobbit movies, and you can, through all sorts of legal machinations, I think that dog has already barked. We already have all sorts of things out there that are non-literary products of varying quality, from excellent to terrible, right? So I don't know that his death kind of ends that era truly, because I feel like it kind of already has passed by despite his best efforts. But I do think it's a loss of one of the great editors. There's this argument that Tolkien was the author of the 20th century. I think there's a really strong argument to be made about that. I suspect that if you fast forward a century or two, he will probably still continue to be read, whereas a lot of people who maybe are more popular or are more respected among the literati maybe are not. It's hard to predict the future. So my apologies to people watching this 200 years from now if I look like a total fool, but that's kind of what I suspect about his work. And as such, as this editor who is deeply invested in that work, who really, I do think, improved the work as he edited it, I think Christopher Tolkien may turn out to have been one of the most important editors. Maybe not like T.S. Eliot important to the entire century, but certainly an important editor. And if I ask you the name of another editor, you probably couldn't name one, but you can probably name Christopher Tolkien. We're sorry for the loss of Christopher Tolkien, and I, for one, am grateful that he continued to have the scholarly output that he had all the way up into the very late years of his life.